In the spring of 1871, the Tallapoosa County Clerk's office in Alabama was flooded with record updates. Births, deeds, marriages, small signs of life trying to reclaim themselves after war and hunger. It was on one of those days, under flickering oil light and the smell of damp paper, that an assistant clerk named Marion Langley turned a page she shouldn't have. Bound in thick calfskin and tied with a silk ribbon, the burial ledger for 1867 to 1870 had been stored among ordinary tax rolls. Its handwriting was pristine, calligraphic, almost obsessive in its symmetry. The entries were arranged with unsettling formality: name, age, cause of death, grave plot number, and date of interment. But something was wrong. 5 entries, each for a local resident, each signed by Elias Whitfield, were dated before the deaths occurred. Some of the names were familiar. One had been Marion's cousin. Another was the son of a teacher who'd vanished during the yellow fever scare. All 5 deaths had happened in 1869. Yet the entries had been signed and notarized in 1868. Neatly, legally, as if time had folded quietly and no one had screamed. The clerk's office didn't call the sheriff. They didn't make announcements. Instead, the ledger was returned to its shelf and Marion was asked to consider context. She was told that in post-war years, many things were done out of order. Death came quickly. Graves needed to be ready. Records were confused, but the excuses felt thinner than the paper they were printed on. She remembered the way each name had its own flourish, how the ink never smudged. These were not rushed entries. These were not clerical accidents. Someone had written them before the bodies were even cold, and someone had planned for those bodies to be exactly where they ended up. What disturbed Marion most wasn't the timing, it was the tone. The causes of death were always benign. Fever, misadventure, childbirth. Clean, distant words, but one entry listed disobedience. Just that. No ailment, no accident, just a word more suited for a courtroom than a coffin. When she tried to bring the matter up again weeks later, she was reassigned to agricultural exports. No explanation, no questions taken. The ledger was gone from its place, and in its absence sat only a newer book, signed with the same perfect penmanship, now recording newer burials, none of which raised alarm because no one dared to compare them to what hadn't happened yet. But Marion did remember. She remembered the names. One belonged to a girl who used to sell gooseberries by the road. Another to an old preacher's wife who'd gone mute in her final year. None were known troublemakers. None had any reason to be watched. And yet their deaths had been written in ink before they were written in blood. Years later, when storms flooded the Whitfield fields and unearthed 3 iron nameplates before the wooden markers above had even rotted, questions resurfaced. The names matched the ledger. The dates did not. The grave plots were precisely measured, already claimed in writing long before they were claimed by death. It would be easy to call it a coincidence, to blame superstition or error. But the documentary begins here for a reason, because once you understand how calmly someone can plan a death before it happens, you start to question how many other graves were dug while their owners were still breathing, and who gave the order to dig them. Elias Whitfield was the kind of man people pointed to when they wanted to believe the South could be rebuilt with grace. Son of Colonel Abram Whitfield, he'd inherited not just land and linen, but the quiet authority of a name spoken with respect in courtrooms, churches, and cotton mills. He dressed plainly, always in pressed gray or bone white, and carried a walking cane tipped with brass he never seemed to need. He wrote with a goose-feather quill he trimmed himself each morning, dipped in walnut black ink he ordered by the bottle from Charleston. His penmanship became its own kind of legend. Birth certificates signed by him were saved in frames, not drawers. Baptismal rosters, land deeds, marriage licenses, death records. He signed them all with the same loop W, the same surgical precision. To outsiders, it looked like stewardship. He kept the town running. He gave out supplies to widows. He opened the schoolhouse every Sunday. He even funded its roof repairs himself. But people forgot something vital. He also controlled the ledgers. He was the man who wrote things down. And what he wrote down was treated as truth, even when it wasn't. Even when it hadn't happened yet. Especially then. What no one noticed, not for years, was that Elias had another set of books, hand-bound, unlabeled, stored in a locked drawer beneath his writing desk. These weren't for taxes or inventory, these were for people. A girl caught swearing in the schoolyard, a man who refused to sign a loyalty oath, a farmhand who slept with the wrong daughter. Each name was followed by a small mark, nothing obvious, a single dash, a tiny red dot, a blackened corner. When viewed together, they formed a quiet map of judgment. The ledger never accused, it didn't explain, it simply noted. Elias called them incongruities to the order, according to a journal entry later discovered in the hollow of his desk. He never said punishment, never said death. But beside several names, he added a second date, months in the future. Some of those dates matched known deaths, some didn't, some were still blank. To the town, Elias was a widower, a father, a man of learning. He attended funerals with solemn dignity, often standing nearest the casket. He never wept, but always bowed his head. When the epidemic took half a dozen children in 1868, he offered space in his family plot. When the chapel burned in 1870, he brought out his own supply of candles for the vigil. People trusted him because he was consistent, but that consistency was a mask. And under that mask lived someone who believed that order required silence, and silence required fear. The town never suspected. They didn't see what he recorded in the margins. They only saw what he offered on the surface: clean lines, good posture, warm bread, and signed documents. But paper doesn't forget. His writing didn't lie, it simply wrote things too early. What seemed like kindness was curation. What felt like stability was control. The signatures that sealed a marriage also finalized a fate. The man who wrote your name in ink had already measured your usefulness. And when he was done with it, he would measure your grave. The ledger would match the earth. The burial would match the record. And the town would go on, never realizing that every kindness he gave came with a cost. Not always to you, but always to someone. June Miller was 12 years old the night she stood before Elias Whitfield and refused to bow. It was the annual Spring Union Gathering, a town event meant to show unity in the post-war South, where tables were dressed in borrowed lace and hands were pressed together in feigned civility. She arrived in a faded dress, seams repaired with string, her hair neatly parted, her feet bare. The older women watched her closely. They knew she was different. A mixed-blood orphan raised by northern missionaries, taught letters before hymns, with a stare that didn't lower. When the time came to curtsy before the town elders, June did not move. She looked Elias straight in the eye, not with defiance, not with hatred. Just the absence of fear. It was a silence louder than disrespect. A girl like her was supposed to yield. She didn't. 3 days later, smoke climbed over the trees east of the chapel road. The house June had lived in, a small wood-frame dwelling behind the missionary post, was gone by the time help arrived. The structure collapsed inward. Fire burned hot and clean. Too clean. Witnesses claimed they'd seen no lightning, no sparks, no reason. Only the red glow behind the pine branches and the smell of scorched linen. Her body wasn't found until the 4th day under the floorboards where she'd tried to hide. Curled into herself, one arm broken, her feet still bare. The coroner marked it as accidental. said maybe she knocked over a lantern, but those who visited the scene whispered that no lamp had been found, that the iron latch on the door was twisted shut from the outside, and that her throat showed signs of bruising long before the fire touched her skin. No one asked why, not aloud, because the answer sat quietly in a drawer in Elias Whitfield's home. June's name had already been written, in clean black ink, slotted between two others both marked for later, her cause of death, improper instruction, her burial date, the morning after her body was found. But the signature on the line was dated 3 days before the fire, not 1 day, not 2, 3. The ink had dried before she had even stood in that gathering, before she had ever locked eyes with the man who would decide she no longer belonged. It was later discovered, though never officially recorded, that Elias had once written in his personal journal about unnatural hierarchy disorder, a term no one else used. He believed in quiet and precise language that children raised without bloodline supervision could become structurally unfit for placement within the community order. June, by that measure, was not an individual. She was a flaw, a symbol of disruption, a reminder of a war he refused to acknowledge had ended. Her presence was disorder, and so he planned her absence with the same clarity he used to draft school rosters and grave ledgers. At her burial there was no sermon, only dirt and one unfinished hymn sung half-heartedly by a traveling pastor. Her name was later removed from the church record. The missionaries who raised her left town before summer's end. No one replaced them. The patch of earth where her house once stood remained black for years. Nothing grew there, not even weeds. A child's drawing, scorched at the edges, was found behind the root cellar days after the fire. It showed a row of stick figures, 4 standing, 1 crossed out. And above them, drawn in steady lines, a large hand descending from the sky. 5 fingers, all pointing down. The townspeople never spoke of June Miller again, but her name stayed inked in the ledger, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned, as if she had simply fulfilled a role written for her in advance, as if her life had never been hers to begin with. By 1923, the Whitfield estate had passed through 3 owners and 7 tenants, none of whom stayed long. The land was still fertile, the house still upright, though its shutters warped and doors swelled in the heat. Children swore the walls whispered. A midwife once claimed the parlor clock ticked backward even without a key. Most ignored these stories, blaming superstition or soil sickness. But when a new buyer filed complaints about rot and shifting foundations, the county sent an inspection crew to assess the damage beneath the old parlor. They removed 3 floorboards, then paused. A draft of scorched air rose from below, smoke-sweet, old, not like something recent. Just beneath the joists, they found the crawl space hollowed wider than expected, its brick lining blackened unevenly like something had once burned slow and deliberate inside it. At first they thought it was just fire damage, until one of the crew, on his knees and reaching between the bricks, pulled out a curled, brittle shape that broke in his hand. It was a rib, child-sized. The investigation was quiet. No reporters, no headlines. The county had no interest in reviving dead stories, especially ones tied to the Whitfield name. But the findings were documented in internal ledgers. 6 bone fragments, all human, all heat-split and soot-stained. One belonged to a jaw with 2 molars intact, never adult. The remains had not been buried. They had been pressed into the brickwork and sealed beneath the floor like an offering. Alongside the bones were bits of scorched fabric, twisted nails, and the remnants of a small tin crucifix melted at the edge. There were no coffins, no marker, no explanation. What troubled investigators most was not the presence of the remains, but their placement. The parlor had no chimney, no hearth, no reason for fire beneath the floor. And yet the bricks had been blackened from within, as if heat had been trapped and focused. Not enough to burn the house, just enough to erase something. Later analysis suggested the bricks had been rearranged after the fire, neatly. Someone had taken the time to hide what had burned but not destroy it completely. It wasn't a panic job. It was quiet, careful. Like someone wanted the memory gone, but the record to stay. Archived documents revealed that during the 1870s, the parlor had been the site of small evening lectures hosted by Elias Whitfield, events described as instructional gatherings for young girls, and those being integrated into household civility. No one ever listed what was taught. No student names were recorded. But two of the names written on a ledger page dated 1872, both listed as corrected in disposition, matched the initials carved faintly into the underside of the floorboards found above the crawl space. One of the girls, age 11, had disappeared the same year from a nearby county. Her case was never followed up. Her mother was institutionalized 2 years later for persistent agitation. The more they looked, the more the house seemed built to forget. Paint layers sealed over old wall markings. A door on the second floor opened to a wall. The basement steps had been shortened by half, leading nowhere. But the crawl space held on. The ashes didn't leave, and neither did the memory of what had happened above them. The discovery was quietly filed under historic structural inconsistency. The bones were stored, not buried. The house was sold again within months, no disclosure required. Years later, when the estate was converted into a grain processing office, a secretary claimed her ink well dried out only in the parlor room. Every time, even when full, and though no fire was ever officially documented on the property, the floor still warped in heat every summer, and the bricks beneath it bled a slow black seep when the rain came hard. As if the house still remembered what was burned and who was meant to be forgotten. In a family so precise, absence was louder than grief. The Whitfields were known for record-keeping so immaculate it bordered on obsessive. Every birth, every debt, every baptism was inked, signed, and bound, except for one. Thomas Whitfield, Elias's younger brother, vanished in 1869. No ledger marked his passing. No obituary graced the county press. No sermon was offered. He was simply not there one day. The excuse given was that Thomas had gone west to survey land opportunities in Texas, but the trains were not running that month. And no ticket in his name was ever bought. Neighbors noted that Thomas's boots had still been on the porch the next morning. His bed was made. His Sunday shirt was missing, but nothing else. No horse, no travel bag, no note, just silence. And for a family that worshipped documentation, silence was the loudest alarm. Elias said nothing publicly. He continued his work as if nothing had shifted. Birth certificates were signed, property lines redrawn, ledgers filled with their careful ink. But in the rare moments when Thomas's name was spoken aloud, Elias would tilt his head slightly and respond, "We've all chosen our paths." No elaboration, no worry. Just that phrase, repeated so often it began to sound rehearsed. What few recalled, what most would rather forget, was that Thomas had been different. Gentler. He taught freed children to read. He refused to join his brother's burial commissions. He'd once argued during a town meeting that fear was not a form of order. It was the kind of softness Elias called dangerous idealism. And then Thomas was gone. It wasn't until decades later, when the estate was being gutted for auction, that something hidden came loose. A wooden armchair, once kept near the fireplace in Elias's private study, was being reupholstered when a seamstress slid open the cushion and found a folded parchment brittle with age. It had been sewn into the inner lining. The ink was still legible, dark as if written yesterday. At the top, in Elias's hand, were 3 words, Trial 7, non-compliant blood. Below that, 2 initials. TW, no date, no location, just a single line under the name, then nothing. The phrase was chilling in its formality. Trial. Not punishment, not discipline. Trial. As if Thomas's fate had been part of a test, an evaluation of method or belief. The term appeared nowhere else in official records. But other items found in Elias's study, the unmarked ledgers, the corrected attendance rosters, the burial drafts, suggested a pattern. Those marked as non-compliant often disappeared soon after. Their graves predated their deaths. Their names entered the books not with mourning but conclusion. Yet Thomas had no page in the public ledger, no entry in the death register. He wasn't given the courtesy of ritual. He was excluded, not merely removed. Family photographs show Thomas last in 1868. He stands to the side, shoulders slightly turned away. In the photo, Elias holds a pocket watch. His other hand rests on a Bible. Thomas holds nothing. His gaze is distant. Some say the brothers had not spoken for weeks by the time that picture was taken, and the day after it was developed, Thomas was never seen again. Years later, the parlor chair was burned during a house-cleaning fire meant to clear old energies. But the page was saved, pressed between glass, now locked in a private archive. When questioned, descendants refused comment. One distant niece referred to Thomas only as the one who went the wrong way. The seat where the chair once rested remains empty in the restored parlor, though no furniture has ever stayed there long. Visitors say the wood creaks in that corner even when no one walks. And so in a house built on records, the brother with non-compliant blood is the only one without a grave, without a name in the book. As if he had not been lost, but erased. As if his absence wasn't just punishment, but proof of something that Elias never wanted recorded. Something too close to guilt, too close to truth. It was meant to be a gesture of grace. The Whitfield matriarch Lillian had sewn it herself, or so the church ledger claimed. A gift for the parish's centennial, the quilt was displayed once in 1870 during a harvest service, then folded and placed in a cedar chest behind the pulpit. The congregation remembered it as beautiful, burgundy squares, ivory trim, threadwork that shimmered under candlelight. No one examined it closely. It was seen as a symbol of healing after war, of unity in the face of ruin. But unity, like thread, can hide what it binds. Decades passed. Ministers came and went. The quilt was forgotten. Until 1931, when a flood cracked open the church's foundation and forced repairs. A locked cabinet was pried loose from behind the sacristy. Inside, wrapped in muslin, lay the quilt, clean, preserved, unmarked by time. But time had not dulled its secrets. The new minister, a young man with a habit of curiosity, unrolled the fabric across the altar. What at first looked like decorative embroidery began to unsettle him. Each patch bore initials, some large, others tiny, stitched just above the hem. The spacing was irregular. Lines of thread connected them, not in symmetry but in jagged angles. Some stitched paths ended in tight spirals. Others dead-ended in crosses. There were no dates, no explanations, just initials, thread, and direction. He brought it to a local historian who cross-referenced the names with parish records. By the third match, her hands began to tremble. Each set of initials belonged to someone who had vanished between 1865 and 1875. A housemaid who never returned from the post office. A deaf boy whose shoes were found beside a dry creek. A widow who walked into the Whitfield orchard and never came out. In total, 38 pairs of initials. 29 of them matched known disappearances. The remaining 9 were unfamiliar, undocumented, untraceable. But the stitched lines connecting them formed a pattern, a web that centered not on the town square but on the Whitfield property. The stitches weren't random. They were directional, measured, topographic in feel. They traced last known locations, proximity to roads, even terrain. Someone had mapped out where these people had been seen last, and how they'd been led elsewhere. When questioned, the oldest living parishioner remembered Lillian Whitfield only vaguely. She'd been quiet, often ill, eyes always downcast. She'd brought the quilt in a cedar box and insisted it be kept from dust. No one knew if she'd sewn it alone. But a photograph taken of the 1870 harvest table showed her standing beside the quilt with gloved hands and a look that did not smile. In the photo, Elias stands behind her. His hand rests on her shoulder, not affectionately, but firmly, controlling, as if reminding her of something. The quilt now rests in a climate-controlled archive, though it is not publicly displayed. Some say the fabric still smells faintly of lavender and soot. The stitches remain intact, pulled tight with a force that suggests not artistry but urgency. A hidden language in thread. A record of wrongs no one dared speak aloud. Whether Lillian meant it as confession or complicity is unknown. What's clear is that the quilt was never meant to warm anyone. It was not a gift. It was a map. One that pointed to the places where silence had walked, and where the Whitfields had already been. In the Whitfield Heritage Museum, housed in what used to be the family's grain barn, one object sat under glass more revered than all the others. A polished cane, made of walnut and capped with a brass knob, long thought to be Elias Whitfield's walking aid. It was displayed beneath a placard that read, "Symbol of Restoration," with a note that he carried it during courthouse dedications and church reopenings in the years after the war. Visitors were told it represented strength and dignity, a reminder of one man's burden to rebuild a fractured town. But history has ways of speaking even through wood, and this cane did not help a man walk. It helped him decide who would be written down. It wasn't until 1956 that the truth began to surface, when a Whitfield descendant clearing out the attic of a dilapidated family home found a journal wrapped in burlap behind a loose panel. The cover was embossed with Elias's initials, though the entries were written in the hand of someone else, most likely a young cousin or hired tutor. The entries were obsessive, precise. They chronicled a series of events labeled only as refinements in correction. Each entry described how children, mostly from the orphanage, some from poor farms, were evaluated for compliance, using what was simply referred to as the measure. The measure was the cane. Lined along its length were 13 shallow grooves, metal inlays notched in quarter-inch increments, almost invisible to the naked eye. Each one served as a timing mark. According to the journal, a child would be struck once and timed silently with a pocket watch. If they cried immediately, they were unfit. If they whimpered but stayed silent, they were in progress. Only those who could remain silent until the third mark, nearly 40 seconds, were considered durable. These terms weren't arbitrary. They determined fate. Children who failed were listed. The entries never explained what being listed meant, but we already know. We've seen the ledgers, the names, the predated burials, the girls who vanished, the boys whose shoes were left behind. The cane, then, was not for walking. It was for measuring. It was not a symbol of dignity. It was a device calibrated for pain. The grooves were not decorative. They were clocks. The child's silence was the test. And silence to Elias Whitfield was not passive. It was proof of submittal, of full control. If pain could be endured without expression, the child was worth keeping. If not, they were a flaw. And flaws, as we've seen, were handled swiftly. The journal includes one final entry. It describes a child who remained silent beyond the 5th groove, long enough that the timekeeper, a boy named Asa, began to shake. Elias, according to the entry, stopped the watch, called the child prepared, and marked the day with a double check in a side column. That child's name is not given, but among the quilt's initials, stitched in a faded patch near the corner, one set repeats. A.J. the cane remained on display for over 70 years before it was examined closely by a historian skeptical of the family's pristine legacy. Under magnification, she found that the grooves weren't just metal. They were etched with numerals barely visible under layers of polish. Not Roman, not decorative, measured, filed with purpose. When this finding was submitted for public review, the museum quietly removed the cane from the exhibit. It was replaced with a photo. No announcement was made, no statement offered. But the case where the cane once lay now holds only the word "Artifact Retired" printed on a small card. Visitors say they still feel uneasy in that corner of the barn. Some swear they hear a ticking sound, soft, deliberate, as if something is still being timed. But nothing moves, and there is no clock. Just the silence that lingers in a room once used to test whether a child could endure pain without making a sound. The Whitfield barn, quiet now and converted into a heritage site, had always been the subject of small-town rumors. Children dared each other to sneak in before it was restored, whispering of traps, sounds in the rafters, and voices beneath the floor. But in 1984, long after the family name had been scrubbed of its stains and repackaged for tourist plaques, a renovation crew hired to repair a termite-infested foundation uncovered something no one had planned to explain. Beneath the main floor, hidden behind stacked crates and rusted implements, lay a trap door flush with the earth. Unmarked, unpainted, sealed not with one iron lock but two. One on the outside, one within. The first lock gave way with effort, the second didn't. Not until the workers pried it from inside the narrow crawl space using hooked tools and the heel of a crowbar. What they found beyond it wasn't storage, it wasn't supply. It was a room. Roughly 6 feet wide and 10 feet long, it had no windows and no light. The air inside had a thickness to it, the kind that clings to cloth and makes breath feel borrowed. Bolted to the center of the floor was a wooden chair, high-backed, carved at the top with curved points, as though meant for formality. Its arms had been notched in 3 places each, stained darker than the wood around them. Rusted shackles hung from either side, attached with worn leather straps. The legs were secured to iron rings, cemented into the ground. This was no chair for rest. This was a chair for holding, but it was the walls that said the most. All 4 sides were carved, not painted, not drawn, carved, with initials, some overlapping, others pressed so deep the plaster cracked around them. There were tally marks grouped in sets of 5, uneven and frantically spaced. Some rose high toward the ceiling, others scratched in low, desperate angles, as if done while restrained. And above all this, dominating the far wall directly across from the chair, was a symbol etched larger than any other. A hand turned palm up, fingers fully splayed. Each fingertip was marked with a star. In the center of the palm, a single circle. No one could explain it. No local folk symbols matched. No religious scholar could link it to liturgy. But one thing was certain, it was drawn many times. Layered, repeated, reinforced as though carved by different hands at different times. As though it was something learned or taught, something remembered under pressure, a mark of those who sat in the chair, or those who watched. In the corner, beneath a shelf lined with empty jars, were bones, animal, some said, but not all. One fragment, a phalange human, still held the thread of a child's ring. No name was associated with it. There was no record of a missing person tied to that room. But no one had ever looked. No ledger had ever listed what went on below the barn. No report filed, no confession given. Only the evidence left behind by those who passed through scratched their names, marked the days, and stared at the hand on the wall. The door was resealed, this time welded shut. The museum brochure makes no mention of it. Visitors are not taken to that part of the property. But those who've seen it say that even now the metal of the outer lock feels colder than the rest of the barn, that the light above the trapdoor flickers when no one moves, and that sometimes in the dead center of the night, the faint sound of wood creaking can be heard beneath the grain floor, like a chair shifting slightly, or someone trying to sit still. Reverend Abner Clark arrived in Tallapoosa County with a Bible in one hand and the belief that faith could fix what war had broken. He was 39, graying early, and spoke softly even when the church rafters needed more volume. His sermons focused on redemption, order, and the healing of wounds too deep for medicine. At first, the town welcomed him. They needed peace, not questions. And Reverend Clark gave them that. He wore plain suits, declined extra offerings, and visited every household that asked. But beneath his measured tone was a habit of quiet observation. He took notes after every funeral, every illness, every unmarked absence, and he kept them in a ledger not affiliated with the church, just his own thoughts, his own questions. Especially about Elias Whitfield. In 1871, Clark began to notice something strange. Elias had burial documents prepared days in advance, not just once, repeatedly. Clark initially dismissed it as prudence, an old man readying for the worst. But then he noticed that Elias began requesting burial blessings without the bodies being present. The funerals became shorter, closed caskets. Sometimes no caskets at all, just dirt, a name, and a signature. When Clark gently questioned why he hadn't seen the deceased, Elias would reply with vague words like delicate matters or timely transitions. The town didn't protest. They trusted the process. But Clark began keeping lists. One entry from his personal ledger read, Miller child, no body shown, grave already dug, signature 3 days prior. Another, Barlow widow, no illness known, burial approved within hours. He brought his concerns to the church council, but they deferred. Elias funded their roof, paid their debts. To accuse him would mean collapsing what little order they had left. Clark, undeterred, visited Elias himself. A meeting was held in the parlor. No one knows what was said, only that it lasted 23 minutes and that Clark left pale, jaw tight, refusing to eat that evening. 3 weeks later, Clark's youngest daughter, Elsie, vanished while walking to fetch water from the edge of the orchard. She was 8 years old, wore a blue ribbon in her hair. The town searched the creek, the woods, the sheds. Nothing was found but her ribbon, caught on the edge of the split-rail fence. No blood, no footprints, no witnesses, just absence. When Clark demanded investigation, the sheriff told him no crime had occurred, that she may have wandered, that children get strange ideas. The Reverend fell silent. 2 days later, Elias presented Clark with a burial document already signed. The space for cause of death was left blank. Clark was told that if he officiated, the town would mourn with him. That closure was important. That order required obedience. Clark folded the paper into his pocket and returned to his pulpit. The next Sunday, he offered no sermon, only a prayer for all those buried before their time. After that, he continued performing burial blessings, never once asking to see the bodies again. His personal letters, found after his death in a rusted tin beneath the church floorboards, reveal everything. One reads, I am complicit now, for I blessed what I did not see, but he took her from me, my light, my truth, and I fear I am not the first he silenced this way. I fear I am far from the last. Elsie's name was eventually discovered in Elias's burial ledger, dated 1 day before she disappeared. Her grave is marked only by a stone with no engraving, just a worn blue ribbon tied to a nail driven into its side. And Reverend Clark, the man who once asked too many questions, spent the rest of his life asking none at all. Long after the Whitfield name had been polished into heritage and the dirt packed flat above unspoken things, a collection of personal papers surfaced in the attic of a farmhouse just 5 miles from the old estate. The house had belonged to the Turner family, generations of gravediggers who had, for nearly 40 years, tended the burial plots ordered by Elias Whitfield himself. Their work was never questioned. Quiet men with calloused hands and eyes that learned not to look too long. But one of them, Josiah Turner, kept records. Not in official ledgers, not in the town's archives, but in a set of worn field journals tucked into an oilcloth pouch and nailed beneath the floorboards of his barn. These weren't just records of names, they were dates, orders, plot measurements, and they didn't match. The first discrepancies were subtle. A plot dug on April 3rd for a death recorded on April 7th, a second dug on the 12th for a death that wouldn't happen until the 20th. But by the time investigators compiled the journal against church and civil records, the pattern emerged in full. Dozens of graves, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, had been ordered and dug before the person inside them had died. In at least 14 cases, the names had been written down before any public record of illness, accident, or natural cause had been declared. Some of those people had been healthy at the time. Some had been children, a few were teachers. One was a woman who had just delivered a child and was expected to recover. She died 3 days later of complications. Her name had been assigned a plot number 2 weeks before. Each order bore the same handwriting, sharp, clean, looping strokes in deep black ink, always signed E. Whitfield, always accompanied by a sealed envelope marked with a small cross or occasionally a hand-drawn star. The gravediggers were told never to open them, and they didn't. Until one day, Josiah's cousin Elijah did. The envelope contained only a slip of paper no larger than a playing card. On it was a name, a date, and one of 2 words, approved or overdue. The date was always in the near future. The name always matched someone alive. The word, well, that was harder to explain. But Josiah noted that everyone marked overdue died within the week. The Turners began to ask questions, carefully in whispers. Why were they digging for the living? Why were these names arriving ahead of death? Josiah wrote that he once tried to delay a burial order just by a few days. The next envelope that arrived contained his name. It was marked pending. He complied immediately. He never asked again. Another entry detailed how a young assistant hired briefly from the local poorhouse commented aloud that some of these folks don't look dead yet. He vanished within days. His name never appeared in town records again. But Josiah noted it beside one of the plot numbers. It was the only entry he circled in red. The journals were found by Josiah's great-granddaughter, who handed them over to a quiet historical society. No charges were filed, no public statement was made. But the journals were cataloged and stored in a locked archive labeled under pre-mortem burial logistics. The title itself is almost absurd, but the meaning is clear. Elias didn't just sign the death records. He commissioned the ground before the body. He planned for absence before it occurred. And anyone who questioned that timing, who asked why the shovels moved before the breath stopped, got listed too. The land remembers. The earth was turned before its time, and some say that on fog-heavy mornings you can still feel the difference in soil packed before death. It's colder, tighter, as if even the dirt was waiting, already told what to do. The flood of 1936 came fast. Rain bloated the Tallapoosa River until it tore past its own banks, swallowing fences and silos and anything light enough to lift. Most things washed away. But one thing washed toward. A wooden crate, no larger than a side table, drifted downstream and caught in the branches of a fallen pecan tree near the town's old ferry dock. A farmer spotted it the morning after the worst of the storm. He thought it was driftwood until he saw the iron latch and the words burned into the lid. For the next flood. No one claimed it. It had no shipping marks, no name, no return address, just those 5 words, clean and deliberate, etched into the pine lid as if the crate had been waiting for this moment all along. Inside were scrolls, 13 of them, hand-inked, bound with cloth ties and dipped in wax so that time couldn't rot the names they held. Each scroll was numbered, and each unrolled in the same format. Columns of names, ages, estimated birth years, no explanations, no occupations, no causes of death, just names and the occasional note in the margin, obedient. Disruptive, silent, unmarked. The ink was the same across all 13, black, tight script, uncannily neat. Historians would later confirm what some already suspected. It was Elias Whitfield's hand. The most horrifying truth wasn't how many names were listed. It was how few of them could be found anywhere else. These weren't recorded in county ledgers or church logs. They weren't buried in marked plots or listed in school attendance. They were absent from every place official memory should have placed them. But they were written here, and that meant someone had counted them, not as citizens, not as children, as numbers. Many of the names were clearly black, surnames given after emancipation. First names common to the freed communities nearby, names passed down by midwives and faith healers. The ages ranged from 4 to 16. Dozens of names repeated across the scrolls with slightly different dates as if the records had been updated over time, tracked perhaps across seasons or ownership. But always by the same hand. Always ordered, labeled. Some scrolls had symbols beside names, an asterisk, a cross, a faded circle. No key was ever found for what those symbols meant. The scrolls were turned over to the county archive, where they caused unease but no investigation. The crate was left in storage, the lid warped from damp, the words still faintly visible under the grain. No one ever determined where the crate had been kept. No church listed it as donated. No property inventory listed it as missing. And yet the scrolls had been sealed with wax that matched the blend used at the Whitfield estate, a mix of pine resin and beeswax, distinctive for its amber sheen. One of the cloth ties used to bind a scroll was later matched to the same fabric pattern found in the quilt Lillian Whitfield had given to the church. The conclusion, spoken in whispers but never put in ink, was that Elias had kept 2 ledgers, one for the town and one for the flood, one for those who could speak and be seen, and another for those meant to vanish quietly, children who would never be counted, never be buried by name, never grow into questions. The scrolls now sit in temperature-controlled drawers opened only for academic review, but every so often, a historian will point to a name and ask why that child never appeared anywhere else. No birth, no death, just an inked record in a crate that should never have floated. A ledger built for water, for forgetting, for what was never meant to stay buried but never meant to surface either. The journal was found in 1948, beneath a hollowed stone in a ravine behind what used to be the Whitfield orchard. It was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of blackened string, its pages stiff with age but legible. No name was on the cover, but inside the first entry was signed, Caleb R., age 14, servant of House Whitfield. He was indentured likely as a ward after the war, one of many children orphaned or sold into long-term labor. But Caleb could write, and more importantly, he could remember. What he wrote was not meant to be read by the Whitfields. It was meant for after. The journal begins simply recording chores, milking, cleaning, tending to the cane shed. But halfway through the pages, the tone shifts. The entries grow jagged, shorter. Fear crawls into the ink. He writes of being told to follow Elias one morning, shovel in hand, past the edge of the orchard to a patch of turned soil. There, under the hush of sycamore trees, a wooden marker had already been staked into the earth. On it, burned with a branding iron, were 3 initials. CRS, his name, his birth year, his grave. Elias said little, only pointed to the earth and said, "We prepare for what we are given." Caleb wrote that his hands shook so badly he could hardly hold the shovel, but he dug anyway. He didn't cry. He didn't run. He didn't ask why. He just carved into the ground as if digging slower might buy him more time. Every shovelful felt like a sentence passed. Every root he pulled free felt like a bone. He noted that the pit had to be deep, deeper than others, as if Elias had measured it in advance. He was given no water, no food, just time, and a shadow watching from the orchard's edge. That night he was locked in the barn. The next day he returned to the hole. The entry reads, "I saw my name again and it no longer belonged to me." He began to hear noises in the night, breathing outside the door, the sound of a cane tapping against stone. But he did not wait for morning. On the 3rd night he pried open a board in the barn's side wall, squeezed through and vanished into the trees. The rest of the journal was written from hiding. He slept under leaves, ate what he could find. He didn't return to town, didn't risk the road. Instead, he made a den in the ravine where he hid during the day and wrote by stolen candle ends. His last entry is uneven, ink running thin. It reads, "I saw the man again. He was near the tree with the split trunk. He didn't call my name. He didn't have to. He knows where the hole is. I think I dug it well. I am not in the ground, but he'll fix that soon." Caleb's body was never found, nor was any official record of him kept by the town. But that grave, marked CRS, was eventually discovered during land resurveying in the 1970s. It was empty, no coffin, no remains, just a stake, now rotted, and a name that no longer had an owner. The journal is kept in a private archive. Visitors are not permitted to touch it. But scanned pages show dirt smudges across the final lines, as if the boy had to close it quickly, as if someone had been coming. Some believe Caleb escaped. Others believe the grave eventually served its purpose. But the truth remains buried, perhaps in another pit dug by another child, marked in advance by the hand of a man who never let names outlive his plans. By 1883, whispers had grown too loud to ignore, a string of deaths too neat, too early, too many. A child vanished after a funeral that had already been planned. A teacher buried in a plot that was paid for 2 weeks before his heart ever failed. And in every instance, the paperwork circled back to the same name, penned in the same elegant hand, Elias Whitfield. He never faced public accusation. He was never arrested, never questioned formally. But people stopped meeting his eye in the street. Church pews cleared when he entered. And still, the town said nothing out loud. The weight of his land, his legacy, his wealth, these things muted justice. But at the state level, silence had become too dangerous, not for conscience, for politics. Internal documents from the Office of Burial Oversight, unearthed a century later, show a directive filed under the heading, "Private Recording Abuse, Tallapoosa Anomaly." The phrase is clinical, detached. But what it led to was the quiet erasure of a man who had written others out of life long before their deaths. Elias Whitfield's name was removed from all public civil roles: registrar, notary, burial witness, school trustee. Every official record that bore his authority was marked invalidated in red pencil, then refiled without public notice. There was no press release, no announcement, just absence, as if he had never served, as if he had never signed anything at all. In the same year, a law was passed, the Dual Attestation Burial Act. It required that all future burials in Alabama be certified by two unrelated parties, a minister and a physician, or a physician and a magistrate. It also forbade the use of single-family burial ledgers as legal documentation. All future deaths had to be entered into centralized town registers and witnessed by at least one person who had seen the body. It was the first of its kind in the state, but the law did not name Elias. The minutes of the assembly meeting where the law was drafted list the reason only as abuse of singular ledger authority in rural municipalities. Elias, in the eyes of the law, had become a footnote to reform, a ghost in bureaucracy. His ledgers, more than a dozen spanning almost 30 years, were boxed and transported under armed escort to the state archives. Not for destruction, for storage. The archivist who received them noted that each book had been wrapped in cloth and bound with a cord, sealed with wax. The wax bore no emblem, no family crest, just a thumbprint. When one volume was opened during initial review, archivists found that nearly half the names inside were not listed in any known census or church record. Some bore only initials. Some included symbols instead of surnames, circles, slashes, hands drawn with splayed fingers. One entry read only, "Too loud." No charges were ever filed. Elias was not removed from his property. He was not excommunicated or punished. He simply stopped appearing. By the end of that same year, sightings of him dwindled. Some said he became ill. Others claimed he moved north. One rumor said he died in the same orchard where his brother disappeared. But no grave was ever found. No obituary printed. His final act, like so many before, was to vanish into the record he had manipulated so long. Today, his ledgers remain under restricted access, not digitized, not on public display, stored in a temperature-controlled vault labeled Privately Maintained Burial Records 1857-1883. That title holds no blame, no names, no truths, just the shadow of a man who used ink like a blade and parchment like a shovel. The law changed, but Elias Whitfield never paid for what he wrote, only for what he didn't. The ledger lies open beneath glass. Its pages are clean, untouched by mold or time. The black ink unbroken even after 150 years. It could have been written yesterday. Names fill the columns, neat even, emotionless. No dates of birth, only dates of death. Except that many of those deaths hadn't happened yet when the ink dried. They were predictions, declarations, plans. Every name was a quiet execution, every line a sentence passed without a trial. The museum display does not say this. The card beside it reads, Burial Register, 1857-1883. It does not mention that many listed within were still alive when their graves were prepared. Beside the ledger sits the quilt, soft, almost beautiful, stitched with patterns only those who know where to look can decipher. The initials are still visible, even faded. Some match names from the ledger, some don't. Some belong to those whose bones were never found. The threads form paths, routes to disappearance, stitched in a language of harm mistaken for heritage. Visitors rarely linger. They comment on the craftsmanship, not the silence inside it. They don't ask why a child's name would be stitched beside a symbol of a star or a noose. They don't ask because the plaque tells them not to. It calls the piece a post-war memorial of unity. That title is a lie, but it is a comforting one. The cane, now locked behind a second case, is polished to a shine. The grooves along its shaft are barely visible unless you know where to look. Once used to time a child's scream, once held by a man who signed certificates with the same hand he raised to punish the soft and the poor. It is called a symbol of legacy in the exhibit guide, a word that hides too much. And yet, all of these artifacts, ledger, quilt, cane, survive. The graves still exist too, many now covered by newer soil, newer names, but the earth remembers. Some of the original plots lie in a family cemetery without markers. Some were later repurposed. One serves now as a community park bench. Beneath it is a girl who never bowed her head. Historians speak softly when asked about Elias Whitfield. They describe him as an administrator, a record keeper, an influencer in civic structure. But privately they admit the deeper truth. He was an architect of loss. His evil was not loud. It was not manic or blood-stained. It did not shout. It documented. It predicted. It counted. And it did so with perfect penmanship, the kind that wins awards in schoolhouses and trust in town halls. He didn't need to drag bodies to pits. He had others do that. He only needed to write. And once written, it became real, final, official. That's the danger, isn't it? That evil, when wrapped in ritual and record-keeping, becomes hard to see. It dresses in lace and speaks in Sunday tones. It attends weddings. It funds school roofs. It folds a child's name into a quilt and calls it preservation. And we, desperate for order, accept it. This documentary does not end with a resolution. There was no trial, no confession. Only the artifacts, boxed and stored. Laws changed, yes. Attestation became required. Ledgers were centralized. But no one dug up the plots that were filled too early. No one named the unnamed. No one apologized to the children who were measured for silence like livestock. Their names were not whispered again, only written. Once. And so the narrator leaves us with a question. A simple one. Heavy as stone. What does it mean when a grave is dug before the person has died? And if it were to happen again, if names began disappearing from rosters, if caskets closed too soon, if kindness came with ink, would we notice? Would we know?